Okay.
We are live.
Cool. So we will start with it mostly. Like, should we start or should we wait for 2 or 3 minutes? How many people are there?
Let's start.
Okay. Hello everyone. Today we have Luca with us. Luca is founder and CEO of Orobix, founder and CTO of TensorWork, and he also wrote a book on PyTorch, which is published by Manning's publication. Luca, can you introduce yourself and tell us about what you work on and what cool stuff you do at TensorWork and Orobix?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the invite, and it's a pleasure. I founded Orobix about 10 years ago here in Bergamo. I was coming from a research experience in medical imaging and computational fluid dynamics for the cardiovascular system. I'm a bioengineer, so I've worked on these topics for about 10 years, and in that time I developed some open source software, and maybe we can chat a bit about the origins of that. In 2009. I was going to have the first kid with my wife, and so I decided also to quit my job to make things more complicated and start a company. And the company stayed very small for a number of years. We were 2, 3 people, and then we were doing mostly medical image analysis for research. But when the wave of deep learning came, it was about 2013, 14. We understood that we wanted to be a company that implements deep learning and AI in critical contexts. So from medical, and then we expanded to manufacturing, and we ended up doing very different things like gaming, for example, or astrophysics. And that was a very, very lucky coincidence that we, put our attention on that, and that developed over time. And right now we are about 30 people, and we received a corporate investment at the end of last year. So now the idea with Orobix is transitioning or evolving from a purely AI engineering company that makes engineering projects end to end for various sectors to an AI service company, because we recognize that when you develop the first version of your model, then the project really starts, and your clients want to put that into a critical environment. And then that's where the big iterations go, when the monitoring and the governance of whatever is in production comes in. And so this is our industrial plan for the future, to become a business to business company to which you can outsource all the governance and life cycle processes for AI systems. And in filling that gap, we also identified a few technical possibilities that could be put forward, especially in the open source space. And so we said, instead of doing this and that, we decided to spin off a company which is TensorWork, which we incorporated in the US last year. And there we're doing very focused technical projects in open source that we can offer to Orobix itself or any other company that wants to adopt it. And there were a few conditions that allowed that. One was that Redis Labs contacted us because they were interested in an experiment we did, putting together TensorFlow at the time and Redis, and became RedisAI later on. And so this and another product that we developed in the meantime, which is Hangar, it's a data versioning software that we started last year, and it's evolving quickly. Uh, that justified the existence of a company that would be, let's say, targeted to developers that will develop systems in the AI era, because really deep learning and AI is transitioning from a purely data science context to a tool that the developers will need to use to develop new systems that are not necessarily prescribed top down, but they can also learn their behavior. And when you put that in the context of development alone, then a few things like software engineering practices that already have some kind of best practices and recognized, they need to be adapted and maybe reinvented a little bit when some of the software that you develop depends on data for its behavior. And this is the space where TensorWorks operates to support future developers in developing software that is data defined in some way. I can't hear you though. Sorry, Jayesh, you're muted. Okay, good.
Yes. So I'm myself big fan of your RedisAI, so you know about that as well. So we will shift to our first question. So what is open source software for you?
For me, it's a big opportunity. It's always been a big opportunity. I can't say I'm a free software movement a person involved with that. Not because I oppose it in any way, but because in my history I was involved in developing open source software. Maybe, uh, but I always considered freedom as a consequence of the fact that certain machinery in open source software development works in a certain way because it's convenient for companies, it's convenient for individuals like me or like you that and engage themselves during spending nights on pieces of software that will end up running a critical part of the infrastructure in a company and you don't even imagine that. And this creates a lot of opportunities. And let's say I think it's a virtuous mechanism by which uh, some a piece of invention uh, can get a life on its own independently on the commercial exploitation. And so also the viability and the guarantees you get around that software are prolonged over time because they're not only a result of a need of a company at a certain point in time that can change anytime, but it's a bit more. And at the same time, it's an opportunity because it's something that can be created unifying many minds. So it can attract minds from different backgrounds, and something like that it's almost impossible in a purely enterprise environment. I mean, it's very hard to realize.
Sure.
So
Yes.
yeah. So that's
So
what it is for me. Yeah.
yes, you can go ahead.
No, I'm done. I'm done. Thank you.
Okay. So how did you become interested in open source software movement? Like, what was your first counter with the open source software, and that intrigued you to be in this space or create something around open source?
Yeah, it dates back a long time. I did my master's degree in bioengineering in 1999. Alas, most of you guys will never will probably be have been toddlers or not even existed by the time.
So
Uh,
I was just born in 1998.
yeah. So yeah. So I finished my. I was doing my master's degrees, and I started programming when I was in sixth grade or something like that. When my father had as a ZX Spectrum 48K, and so that was great because you could see all the basic command, the for, while in the keys. You could read them, and as a kid, it was great to just sit in front of the keyboard because my father wouldn't allow me to use it, but at least I could look at the keyboard and see those commands. And that triggered my curiosity. And I taught myself a bit of basic, not a lot. And then I didn't do anything about programming for a long time until I got into master's degrees, and my supervisor said, "Okay, you need to do this." As a bioengineer, I had to reconstruct the structure of a renal glomerulus, which is a network of capillaries in the kidney. There are 1 million of them in your kidneys, and we wanted to reconstruct them in 3D from microscopy. And so VTK, Visualization Toolkit, had just been released, and there was a book about it, and it was written in C++. So he said, "You need to work with this, learn it." So I I I I started writing horrible code, but that software was already BSD licensed at that time, and it originated from people at GE, Bill Lorenzen, who unfortunately passed away a few months ago. And he was the creator of the marching cubes algorithm that you can use. It's in 3JS. You can use it to create isosurfaces of volume. Like if you have a volume that contains an image, 3D image, you can create a surface out of that if you decide the gray level at which you want to create your isosurface. And marching cubes is a very fast and efficient algorithm to do that. And in creating this software, they wanted to make it open source. And at the same time, Kitware, the company that ended up developing CMake for VTK, because they wanted to develop something that could be compiled on Windows, on Mac at the time, probably wasn't the target, and Linux and many architectures. So they needed something to manage that mess that is compiling a C++ program in different environments. And they created CMake just for this reason. But anyway, VTK was open source with a very liberal license, like BSD at the time. Then they transitioned to Apache 2, I think. And that taught me a lot because they already had in 99, 2000 dashboards to see continuous integration. Like they had pipelines of tests, and you could see the dashboard and so on. And that was a really great teaching experience for me. And then I eventually went to Canada for a postdoc, and I landed at Research Robert Institute, which is Roberts Research Institute. Sorry, it's a research institute in London, Ontario. They were doing medical imaging there, and I was in an environment with like 100 developers developing around VTK and other tools, and people were using Python there. One of the first versions, of course, very early, like Python 2 something. With VTK, and that I started to breathe the concept that you could actually release something on your own and make it useful for others, and get recognition from it, and be committed to it. And so the next year, in 2004, I released my first open source library, which is used today for bioengineering type of context, which is called VMTK. You can look it up at vmtk.org. It's a library with which you can model blood vessels and analyze center lines and so on from medical images. And it was developed in Python. My Python at the time looked like bad C++ written in Python. but it was great, to put it out there, and they maybe go visit a group in Norway and see that they were using it, and it was mind blowing. It was almost like, no, don't use it. Be careful. But and so for me, it was always, as I said before, a big opportunity. Open source was always a big opportunity for me to conjoin fun and opportunities for work and other things and friends.
That's great, and that was like really interesting story as well. So you have seen shifts from industry, like when we used to consider open source as unreliable at some point, and then now many major organizations rely on open source software. So what do you think about it? How this transition happened, and what caused this whole change?
Hmm. I don't know how. Well, the reason why big corporations use open source is elaborate, I think. For sure, at some point, I remember the time where you say, yeah, but that is open source stuff, like meaning,
Yeah.
it's amateurish. But in fact, coming from VTK and seeing, those best practices put in place, I think that was already in some pockets, there was some recognition that open source was good. But in enterprise, that this wasn't that way, in fact. But I think the transition, so with open source, it's become a model that, like if you develop a database, I think much of it came from the web stack and database space. First, probably web stack and web programming earlier, and then database later. Today, it's very hard to put out a database without open source in it, unless you're Oracle. because it comes with a form of guarantee that will exist independently of somebody, pulling the plug. um, and, and but at some point it became something like, uh, a big corporation putting out open source to attract talent. So it's very hard to attract talent, and it's one of the biggest problems for big companies to steal talent from others. And one way to attract a nerd is to get to show them how such cool things you can do, how you can be involved, and maybe if you aspire at participating in something, giving you the possibility to start contributing and testing you along the way. So it's kind of a no-brainer. And I think the shift was mostly due to the recognition that value doesn't come necessarily from the amount of lines of code, and and the recognition that a piece of software requires a massive amount of hours to be reliable. And so uh, with the advent of software as a service, probably open source, and the decrease of licensing models, as you pay a license for this software in order to use it. Now it's more, you pay something for a service that you can assemble from open source pieces. And so open source stopped to become a threat to the licensing model, as I pay a license key for this software, and became instead a component of a software as a service model, where software as a service is composed by many, many pieces of software. And so I think that's where, it's a bit of many things, but I think these two factors are the most.
What's your opinion in general about cloud platforms using open source softwares? Like, uh, there are many issues around it, and then what's your overall opinion about the whole thing?
Yeah, so that's a big question. Also because this is an AWS user group, so this is particularly, there's a lot of debate around this, precisely for the fact that uh, once once an open source project or open core company develop having an open source kind of enterprise, then service model becomes popular, then of course the big cloud providers tend to say, okay, good, I'll take the open source project, put it behind a service, and leverage my domination of the market and make it so easy to use that I can actually appropriate that service and funnel money to me rather than to the ones who invested in developing the software. On one end, again, um, I recognize the problem, and this is one of the reasons why many licenses for databases to nowadays are changing. It's not just Redis Labs, but it's been Mongo, it's been Cassandra. They started changing their licenses to prevent this appropriation and to make it a bit more healthy. And I totally understand that process, and I totally understand big corps saying, well, there's a need, we have the means to do it, we just have to connect two pieces, and the license allows that. So it's more of a fairness. When things go in the fairness direction, uh, things uh, become complicated, because you can respect the license without being fair. And what's being fair changes according to where you sit, on what side of the table you sit. Um, so I think there will be an evolution of open source software moving forward. I think the signals have already been there. It will continue to be an opportunity, but I think we are in a transition phase where we need to find a new balance between that. But that happens only for very successful projects. So when a project becomes really used by everybody, then there's this danger. If you're small, you don't have to worry. Like, of course, it's all it. You see only the opportunity part of that. So, but when you have a
Yeah.
business, on it, then it becomes a question, and I don't have a good answer.
Sure. So there's one question from audience as well, that how open source software company earns money or generates revenue.
Yeah, there are many models with which you can do this. What TensorWork started to do is to develop an open source offering as open as it can. So it's not just open core; it's open. Like you can get a system that can do many things for you, even in the open source. And then um, and then you offer your expertise around a piece of software, so that if you, as a bigger company, if you work with business to business, of course, if a big business or bigger business wants to adopt your technology, then they will probably need you to make sure that that software used in the best way possible. B, that if there are any troubles, I can call you on the phone, and I don't have to grow my internal team knowing your software and inheriting your technical debt just because you don't want to support it anymore. And so I think right now, for a small company, developing open source is an exceptional opportunity, because you can sell your knowledge around the piece of software that you developed that gets adopted. The point is how you make it adopted. But this is happening with TensorWorks. So we received requests for interest and we're currently working um, at making our software adopted. So this is the way. I think it's halfway through um, a subscription model and a consultancy, because then you have to work with your client, trying to understand how to better optimize their infrastructure for your piece of software, and how to or there's also the sponsorship model, which we adopt as well. Like you can pay for uh, us looking into the priorities of the open source software, and maybe bumping up a feature that you desperately need for your system, so that we, instead of saying that they're all equally prioritized, there's something that gets a bit prioritized because we get a sponsorship for it, but the software stays open source. So this is a model that we like a lot. So there are many opportunities.
And, and like just align with that question itself. So I wanted to ask if so what is your choice, like free open source software or paid open source software?
Uh, I think it depends on the context. So I think open source needs to be well. If you develop open source software, open source license doesn't allow you to limit the way your software will be used, and so the concept of paid is just if you can provide an added value on top of what you already release. Um, so if you I think doing things in between, it's a bit more complicated. So you
Yes.
you you need to be you need to have proven yourself already, and the technology has needed to have proven itself for you to uh, uh, at least to limit the way you use it, like source available licenses, because this is it's a bit of a roadblock for the legal department, right? So there has to be trust already established. Like Redis Labs is doing that because they have the problem that we were talking about before with cloud providers, and they already gained recognition from from the community, from other companies, uh, on what they do. So they can do it, and they can guarantee that they will play it fair. uh, but for a company like TensorWork, I think open source, open, free open is better for our own products. Like RedisAI is co-developed, but Hanger is our own. So for our own, we'll choose BSD, Apache 2, those kind of licenses, and put services on top. But I don't think there's a right or wrong way. I fully back uh, decisions on either way. I think if something is genuinely done with a rationale, then it shows. If it's just there to lure people and then play tricks, then it shows immediately. And it's the beauty of open source is that vaporware is really easy to spot. So you can't hide in many places.
And what's your in general opinion about like how open source software is having economic impact on the industry? Like how that's gonna impact the industry in the future and how it's impacting right now as well.
Yeah. Uh, I think for some technologies, open source has become a requirement. So in some way, I think for a company to adopt a technology, then there has to be some sort of guarantee that the company, if all else fails, if uh, the startup scene is very dynamic. Startups get acquired, startups, transition, disappear, and so on. So in this, it's not that you talk to a few enterprise folks anymore. Even sufficiently large companies tend to disappear and reappear and so on. And having open source software is kind of a guarantee that if all else fails, I can always hire somebody uh, in my development team to take care of that piece of software. So I think in the software as a service world, whoever builds components needs to have visibility, at least partial visibility, on the source, and it's a de-risking strategy. Uh, and so I think this will be the same thing in the future. What may change in the future for some players is the way they license it. So there will be licenses that are at the boundary between open and closed, and we were talking about that before. But I didn't see something super final yet. Uh, there's still some debate, and legal departments have to be okay with it as well, and they take a bit of time because of course it has to stand the first litigations, and it's a long process. um, but the principle is that you have to minimize risks adopting a technology that is really hard then to eventually maintain if you don't have potential control over it.
Makes sense. Yes. So, like, can you tell us about some interesting stories when you are developing this open source softwares? Like some things which might be like funny as well. So, so there might be some experiences behind all this thing, and if you can share some.
Yeah. So I participated. So I had many phases. One was the medical imaging phase. Then I started aerobics, and then I got really into. I got passionate about technologies like Redis, and but I didn't contribute to it. And Closure. I went. I had my functional programming period and phase, and that was very interesting. I wrote a very wacky project that ended up in the front page of Hacker News for like a bunch of hours. Uh, it's a closure like language implemented with JavaScript macros. So you can mix the closure syntax with JavaScript and immutable data structure. It's called keylang, ki-lang.org, and I still have it on there. It was quite funny. And not that I am a programming language designer at all. It was just something that happened over a few days, and I got interviewed, and that you know that surprised me for how these seemingly irrelevant things can bubble up, and then the bubble just burst, and and you're back to what we were doing. So um, and then my next open source thing was probably related to PyTorch, and this was the best experience probably I've had, and in all these cases I really learned a lot. With PyTorch, I had written a small pull request for Torch 7, the one implemented in Lua, but it was a very minimal one. And then when PyTorch was released, I got very excited because I really liked Torch 7, but we moved away at Orobix for the Lua thing. It wasn't well integrated with the ecosystem, so people had trouble, switching from Lua to Python, data scientists and so on. And so I started setting a few PRs, and eventually met the core contributors, the core team, and I kept contributing for 1 year and a half, and it just blew, like, sitting there. I felt like overwhelmed by how brilliant people over there were, and so I can't express how much I learned from that experience. But still, be able to say your thing and say, "Ah, I did this small thing," and eventually got included and so on. It was a great encouragement. And by the time I was almost 40 years old, so I'm 44 right now. So it's never too late, to embark in in these things. And I eventually met them, and I made friends, and so as one of the core contributors says, I came from for PyTorch, and I stayed for the company. And then I had to slow it down because uh, work was increasing and my nighttime was shrinking because I was working on a few pull requests and so on. And at some point I had to just stop. But that is the time when RedisAI started, which was a bit smaller in scope, because PyTorch is a very big system, and let's say there are many people working on it. So you really have to keep up with the decisions that they take, and you have to kind of follow along and align, and it takes a bit of time to get into the flow. At least for me, it takes time to me. I know contributor like Adam Paschke, one of the creators of PyTorch. He is brilliant, and and he was doing his master's degree in computer science, bachelor in mathematics, and running, like, it was all over the place. PyTorch, he was designing things, and he would do a pull request review uh, that would have taken me like a week to even approach it, and he would just he saw things, and he still does. uh, but that was a lesson to me. It was very, very inspiring, and but even that, I know I'm not like that, and I'm fine with it. Like, it was great to be able to contribute with your little thing. And so I think this is the best lesson for open source. It's probably you don't have to get anxious. If you keep at it, then you will be able to contribute something meaningful. Um, just don't do it for the recognition. Just do it for the curiosity of a part of it.
And it shall be the satisfaction that in a project which is being used by multiple companies, you have contributed a little bit to it. So it is great feeling as well, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So there's one more question from audience, like how we can get involved in open source projects, and which has like very used code base, or
Yeah.
like the very matured projects.
Yeah. So there are two ways to do that, I think. One is approach it from the ecosystem side of things. So if you like, PyTorch has its ecosystem. Redis has a lot of ecosystem because all the client libraries, and um, when I was in my closure phase, I I was interacting with the Carmine, which is the Clojure client. So I think approaching it from the ecosystem side lets you, not like approach it in phases. It's a bit slower, or it's a bit smaller in scope. There may be a bit more low hanging fruit, and then you can approach the core, because for sure, uh, you don't have to actively look for what your big thing will be, because you don't know if this will come in time. You first have to, let it in get it in a bit of it at a time, approach it in small steps, and at some point you will notice something that needs fixing, or that it's not really working for you, but it's impossible to know it in advance, or to say, okay, I'll change the way this software behaves because I know better. This is the wrong way to approach things. But so ecosystem is one, because you play with the big thing, you see it behaving in a certain way, and you start getting into the community. um, and the other way is directly in the project. Let's say there are a few projects that you can see that they're starting up, and in the startup phase, when they start to take off, this is a very good moment to be there. Like for PyTorch, it wasn't made on purpose, but in fact, I recognized that I was involved in the phase where, like, from zero point 0.1, 0.2, 0.4, up until I think about 1.0 or 0.9. And in that phase, PyTorch became something that, you could know everybody who was working on it, to the stage where you couldn't possibly know it if you weren't there physically, uh, or there were many engineers working at it. And so that gets easier. So if you identify a project that has promise, then probably it's a good you can catch low hanging fruit that can make you understand the flow of the project, and so on. And if the project is mature, maybe there is a set of first issues or small things you can work on, um, but it's a bit harder, I think, to get into things. But so if a code base is a very large, I think the best strategy is to focus on something narrow. So, for example, PyTorch. I get back to PyTorch just because it's an example that worked for me. The C++ part, like the exporting a graph to run it in production part. This is something that I kind of had I wanted to see it happening, because I wanted to use their work, and I maybe didn't care, like I didn't contribute to the high level API. So just identify your small area of intervention, and eventually something will pop up that needs fixing. And at that point, uh, you're part of the project. And you know, I think doing bits and pieces here and there is also a way to approach it, but it's a bit less efficient, I think.
Sure, that's a great guideline for newbies and people who wanted to get started with open source software and contribution. And as well as they can also start with contribution in docs, which will be also helpful, right?
Yeah, documentation, of course. Yes, absolutely.
Uh, so yes, so this were all questions from us around open source software and how it's gonna impact the industry and how what we are doing right now. Some guidelines from you. So what will some final thoughts will give about the whole thing?
Sorry, can you say it again, because you were breaking up for me?
So I was asking what will be your final thoughts about the whole scenario right now?
Well, I think it's again, I see it uh, in the prospect of yeah, from the point of view of opportunities and learning. This is how I would frame it. We are fortunate that open source works that way for large companies because as small developers, it lets us get in the field and get real if we want, um, in a less inapproachable way. You don't have to know people that know people and so on. But I want to
Yes.
spend a final word uh, on being privileged. So I recognize that I was privileged throughout my action as a contributor and so on. First, because I could spend time on this, uh, and second, because probably the overall tendency is to uh, uh, I wasn't coming from a background that was making it harder for me to be listened to. So this kind of privilege is something that allowed me to also to have less barrier in accessing certain communities. And I'm not saying that the communities I participated to were necessarily closed to diversity at all, but we all live uh, in a way or another, more or less, in a world where uh, privilege is something that is just entrenched in the processes in people's mind and so on. So I think if something is worth spending time and effort on is to recognize as an open source maintainer or even a contributor as part of a community to avoid fueling those uh, perverse mechanism by which the ones who are listened to are most heard are always heard more and more, and the ones that are having a hard time being heard have more and more of a hard time being heard. So I think the big responsibility we all have, apart from technical aspects, is exactly to look into how we are and our defects, our flaws, and try to recognize those and work against them, because it takes effort. And I fully recognize my suspect. I don't think I fully recognize my privilege, but I know it's there at least. And so I think this is the biggest thing. Being part of a community, it means being inclusive, not fuel flame wars. This is better than that. It's really not where the value is, and I don't see it recognized in core team members and so on. I never heard about that in all the communities I've been in, but a lot of the fringe, parts of the communities, I see it happening, even if it's not encouraged. So my question is, as part of the closest core community of some project, how can we should take responsibility also for these people fueling this perverse mechanism. So if we don't do nothing, we choose to fuel them. We have to make the best we can to fight them actively. So I don't know if I if I express myself, but this is something that really bothers me. So
Sure, that was interesting. So, like just getting out of all this thing, and on a personal basis, like how are you coping up with this COVID-19 situation, and what are you doing in your free time with your family? What are your strategies to cope up with this whole thing?
yeah, well, unfortunately, I'm in a region that was one of the culprits of the pandemic. I'm calling from Bergamo, Italy, so it's exactly where one of the hotspots were, and we had a lot of losses, even not people close to us. And I have two kids, so they're being very good staying at home. But now we are all restless, but we have to resist, because basically nothing has changed from January, like from a boundary conditions. So all we can do is be in this enable distances, wearing a mask, and not be a pain in the back about it, and be responsible. I think it's a time of great responsibility for all of us. So, and again, I think the privilege here is working, being able to work remotely. So none of my companies have stopped. We all work from home, and that was a great thing to make time just go. And it was a bit harder to cope with the kids doing homework and you having to work and so on. But again, it just worked quite well. So for the future, I don't know. We are all here, and we have to play it by ear. The biggest, all the pandemics had a double peak historically because of how people behaved, also for seasonalities, but also because people went back to normal and then there was a big outbreak again. And I hope this doesn't happen. I hope there's enough sensibility in the population, but it's kind of unavoidable. I hope also that my region here takes tracing and testing a bit more aggressively, which doesn't seem the case. Well, not 100%, but let's say we could do better.
Sure. So we can only hope for people to be more sensible and then act sensibly, and maybe we will fight this whole thing and get together back as a good society. We can hope for that. So it was very interesting talking to you and discussing about open source software and how it's going to impact the industry, or how it's impacting right now. So it was great hosting you, and it was a pleasure you were here. So thank you for coming and thank you for joining in. Uh, so we will stop on this thought and stay safe. We hope you all be safe and come out of this whole thing all together. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.